I still don't know why we didn't turn around after seeing that sign. It was old, barely standing, half swallowed by ivy and moss, like the forest itself was trying to erase it. The words, carved deep into rotting wood, read, "Welcome to Black Pines Forest, no camping beyond this point." Someone had scratched over "no camping" with a knife. Underneath, in uneven letters, there was something else carved into the wood. "Stay out after dark and you won't leave." I wish that had been enough to scare us off. It wasn't. It was supposed to be the perfect trip, one last adventure before everything changed. College was coming fast, and soon we'd all be scattered across different states, different lives. Just 4 friends, me, Darren, Rachel, and Connor, chasing that dumb teenage feeling of invincibility. But looking back, I think something in those woods was waiting for us. We set up camp about 6 miles from the main road, completely off-grid. No cell service, no nearby campsites, just endless trees and the sound of our own footsteps crushing dead leaves. The air smelled thick with pine and rain-soaked earth. The first few hours were normal. We pitched our tents, built a fire, told the same tired horror stories everyone tells in the woods. The usual stuff. It didn't stay usual for long. It started with the sounds. We were sitting around the fire, laughing at one of Darren's awful impressions when we heard it, this low, heavy crack from deep in the trees, like something massive had just shifted its weight. Everyone went quiet. "Probably a deer," Rachel said, her voice too casual to be convincing. But then came the second noise. Closer. Crack. Snap. Crunch. Heavy, dragging footsteps in the underbrush. "Okay, that's not a deer," Darren muttered, reaching for the big hunting knife clipped to his belt. I stood up and aimed my flashlight toward the tree line, sweeping it across the dark. Nothing. Just rows of tall black shapes stretching into infinity. Until I saw it. 2 pale reflections. Eyes or something like them, too high off the ground to belong to any animal that should have been out here. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched. The fire flickered like it suddenly couldn't breathe. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking on the last word. The footsteps stopped. And the eyes disappeared. We should have left right then. Packed up, hiked back to the car, and never looked back. But we didn't. Instead, we convinced ourselves it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a raccoon's eyes catching the beam? Yeah, raccoons climb trees, right? We turned in for the night around midnight, all of us too wired to sleep. I lay awake in my tent, listening to the wind pick up through the trees, the branches groaning like old bones. Every gust made the fabric of my tent shudder. Then I heard the first knock. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. It was soft, barely there, like someone or something was running their knuckles down the outside of my tent wall. I held my breath. Waited. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the other side. I couldn't move. Couldn't even whisper for help. The air inside the tent felt thick, like I was breathing through wet cloth. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A low voice rasped from just outside the thin layer of nylon between me and the dark. "Why didn't you leave?" Morning couldn't come fast enough. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl out of my tent, the first thing I noticed was that Rachel and Darren were already up, pale, silent, staring at the fire pit. Then I realized why. Connor's tent was gone. Not just empty, gone. Stakes ripped from the ground, the whole thing dragged into the woods like something had hooked it and pulled. The grass where his tent had been was flattened and deep grooves cut through the dirt like fingers had clawed into the earth, dragging it away. Darren's voice was low and flat when he finally spoke. "His pack still here? Maybe he went for a walk?" Rachel suggested, but we both knew how stupid that sounded. Connor wouldn't have left without his bag, his phone, anything. We searched the woods for hours. No sign of him, no footprints, no broken branches, no sound. Just silence and those endless black pines stretching in every direction. And then, as we were about to give up, Darren found something half buried under a pile of dead leaves. A scrap of nylon. Tent fabric. Torn clean through like it had been cut. No, not cut, ripped. And next to it in the mud were footprints. Bare. Human. But they were facing the wrong way. Like whoever or whatever they belonged to had been walking backward. We didn't speak for a long time. Just stood there, staring at the backward footprints in the mud, the ripped tent fabric clutched in Darren's shaking hand. Rachel was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave. Now." No one argued. We packed everything in under 10 minutes, no folding, no sorting, just shoving things into bags and trying not to look at the woods for too long. Every branch felt like it was leaning closer, every gust of wind carried the suggestion of something moving out there. Watching. We left Connor's gear where it was. None of us had the nerve to touch his stuff. It felt like admitting he wasn't coming back. The hike back should have taken 2 hours. It didn't. We walked for nearly 4, following the same trail we took in, past the same moss-covered rocks, the same sun-bleached log split down the middle, the same crooked tree shaped like a broken finger. But the car never came into view. And then I saw it, a crushed beer can lying half-buried in the dirt. The same beer can Connor had tossed on the ground the day before. "We're going in circles," I whispered. "No way," Darren snapped, pulling out his compass. "We've been heading west the whole time." He tapped the glass face of the compass with increasing desperation. "I don't understand, this doesn't make any sense." The needle spun wildly, jerking back and forth like it was caught between magnetic fields. Rachel grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "We're lost, aren't we?" No one answered. The sun was dying by the time we found the clearing again. Our campsite. Exactly how we left it, almost. Connor's bag was sitting by the dead fire pit. Neatly packed. The tent that had been dragged away was back too, standing upright, its entrance zipped shut. None of us wanted to get closer, but Darren stepped forward like something was pulling him. He crouched next to the bag and slowly unzipped it. Empty. No clothes, no food, not even the flashlight Connor always carried. Just a folded piece of paper tucked into the front pocket. Darren read it, his voice hollow. "You should have listened to the sign. We didn't sleep that night." The fire burned low, casting twitching shadows across the trees, each flicker of light revealing more than I wanted to see. Branches moved without wind, bending low as if listening. Shapes seemed to shift just out of reach, the darkness thick like oil. Around midnight, the noises started again. First, the same dragging footsteps circling the camp, slow, deliberate, patient. Then, the whispering. At first, I couldn't make out the words. Just soft murmurs like wind through dead leaves. But then, the whispers started taking shape. "Why didn't you leave? We're so glad you stayed." And then, worse. "You're next." Rachel broke first. She stood up suddenly, grabbing her pack. "I'm not staying here. I don't care where we go, I'm not dying in these woods." "Rachel, wait," Darren started, but she was already sprinting toward the trail. The fire sputtered. The shadows stretched longer. And then the screams started. They didn't last long, no more than 30 seconds, but they were enough. Enough to make my blood turn cold. Enough to remind us that whatever was out there didn't want us to leave. Darren and I didn't move for the rest of the night. At dawn, we found her backpack on the edge of the clearing. Inside, her phone screen was cracked, but still glowing. There was only one message on it, sent sometime after midnight, even though there was no signal out here. From Rachel. "It's not dead. It's pretending to be me." That's when I realized it wasn't hunting us randomly. It was replacing us. One by one. We should have left the moment we found Rachel's phone. But where would we go? Every path led us back to the same clearing, and even if we could find a way out, what if we didn't make it before it caught up? Darren and I sat in silence as the sun clawed its way up the sky. Neither of us said what we were thinking, that Rachel was gone. That Connor was gone. And that whatever had taken them wasn't just out there anymore. It was here. Watching us. Waiting. We spent the day trying to ration what little food we had left, planning useless escape routes. But every trail we tried led back to the same hellish clearing. And then, around dusk, we heard it. Rachel's voice. It came from the trees, soft, weak, like she was hurt. "Guys, help. I'm cold." Darren stood up too fast, his face pale and shaking. "That's Rachel." "No," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "It's not. Listen." The voice didn't sound right. Too flat. Like someone trying to remember how she spoke but getting the details just a little wrong. "I don't want to die alone, please." Darren's eyes filled with something worse than fear or hope. "We can't leave her out there." I tightened my grip on his wrist. "That's not her. You read the text. It's pretending." The voice kept calling. Louder now, almost desperate. "I hear you breathing. I know you're there." The sun bled into the horizon and night fell too quickly. The fire was down to embers again, and every inch of my body screamed at me to move, to do something before the dark swallowed us whole. That's when I noticed Darren wasn't next to me anymore. "Darren?" No answer. I spun around, my breath cutting in and out in short bursts. His backpack was still by the fire. Knife gone. Then I heard it. A soft, wet crunch from the tree line. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, hands shaking so badly the beam jumped across the trees in frantic bursts. And then I saw him. Darren. Or at least, it looked like Darren. He was standing too still, eyes glassy, his head tilted slightly to one side like his neck wasn't connected right. His clothes were soaked in something dark, too thick to be just mud. "Come back to the fire," I choked out. His mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong on his face, too wide, too sharp at the corners. Then he spoke, and every hair on my body stood on end. "It's better if you don't fight." That wasn't his voice? I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. My legs carried me through the underbrush, branches clawing at my skin, ripping open lines of fire across my arms and face. But the footsteps followed. Not Darren's heavy boots, bare feet slapping against the dirt. Too fast. Too close. Every time I stumbled, I could hear him, it getting closer. That voice, in perfect imitation, whispering in my ear. Why are you running, man? We're your friends. I didn't stop until I found the road. I thought it was the road. The gravel beneath my feet felt familiar, the painted white line cutting through the dark like a lifeline. But the trees were wrong. They leaned in too close, their trunks forming shapes that almost looked human in the moonlight. And then I realized the worst thing. It wasn't a road. It was a circle. I'd run myself back into the clearing again. The fire was still burning. Barely. And next to it, Darren's body. Not the imitation, the real one this time. His throat was open, a red smile cut too wide across his neck, eyes wide with a fear that hadn't left even in death. But the worst part? He was sitting upright, head tilted in that same unnatural angle like someone had posed him to watch me come back. The phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Darren's number. You're almost ready. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat by the dying fire, clutching the knife I'd pulled from Darren's cold fingers. The whispering didn't stop. But now the voices weren't just coming from the woods. They were in the clearing. Circling me. Laughing. Almost done now. You're the last one left. And then we'll be whole again. By the time the sun clawed its way up through the trees, I wasn't sure if I was still alive or if I'd slipped into some waking nightmare where sleep didn't matter anymore. The fire was nothing but cold ash. The woods around me had gone back to their suffocating silence. No wind, no birds, nothing but that heavy stillness. The only proof that any of it had happened was Darren's body sitting where I'd found him. But something was different now. The phone. It wasn't buzzing anymore. The battery had died sometime in the night, screen black and useless in my pocket. The last message still burned in my brain, though. You're almost ready. Ready for what? I knew I couldn't stay in that clearing. If I stayed, I'd end up like the others, sitting there with that glassy stare, mouth stretched too wide, watching for whoever came next. I forced myself to move, every muscle screaming as if the forest itself was trying to glue me to the ground. This time, I didn't bother following the trails or trying to orient myself with the sun. Logic didn't matter here. The forest didn't follow rules. Instead, I focused on something simple, just keep moving toward the light. Every clearing, every spot where the trees thinned just enough for the sun to break through, I made myself walk faster. And that's when I found the trail cameras. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, shapes hidden in the trees, reflections that weren't supposed to be there. But when I got closer, I realized they were real. Old, weather-beaten motion-activated trail cameras strapped to tree trunks. Some were broken, their lenses cracked and overgrown with moss, but a few were still intact, their little red lights blinking faintly. Someone had been watching this part of the forest. And they'd been doing it for a long time. I followed the cameras, praying they'd lead me somewhere. Maybe a ranger station. Maybe another campsite. Maybe anything that wasn't death. Instead, they led me to a clearing that felt wrong. The grass here was dead, trampled flat into the dirt like something heavy had been moving through it over and over. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, rusted-out trailer, one of those tiny, windowless ones you'd expect to find abandoned behind a gas station. But the door was wide open. And inside, the smell hit me first. Rot. Dampness. Old blood and mildew mixed into something thick enough to taste. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with VHS tapes, plastic containers filled with rolls of undeveloped film, and worst of all, old notebooks. I picked up the nearest one and flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like whoever wrote it had been living with fear for years. The first entry was dated 1998. The copies come at night. Don't let them see your face. If they get your voice, you're next. Another page, this one written over and over again like a mantra. Don't answer if they sound familiar. They're not your friends anymore. The last entry wasn't written at all, just a single Polaroid photograph taped to the inside cover. It was blurry, taken at night. For figures sat around a campfire. One of them was me. I dropped the notebook, bell rising in my throat. The room suddenly felt too small, too alive. And then I heard it again, footsteps outside the trailer. Slow. Heavy. I crouched low, heart slamming against my ribs, gripping the handle of Darren's knife so tightly my fingers went numb. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. And then, from behind me, a voice whispered, "Why didn't you stay by the fire?" I spun around, nothing there. But when I turned back toward the door, something was waiting for me in the doorway. Connor. His eyes were glassy. His skin was pale, stretched too tight across his face like it had been pulled from something dead and pinned into a smile. But it was his voice that broke me. It was perfect. "We were worried about you, man. You left us behind." I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't breathe. He took a step forward, then another, his movements jerky like he was being puppet from the inside out. "You don't have to be scared anymore. Just come back to the clearing." That's when I noticed something worse than his voice, worse than his smile, worse than the fact that he wasn't Connor anymore. His clothes. They were covered in dirt. Twigs stuck out from the sleeves. Mud caked around the knees. His shoes were gone. But his feet were facing the wrong way. I ran. Again. No plan, no direction, just raw survival screaming through my veins. The forest blurred around me, the trees stretching into long black shapes, clawing at my arms and face. My lungs burned, and every time I stumbled, I could hear him getting closer. "Not running. Just walking. You'll feel better soon. We're all waiting. You'll be just like us." And then, like a miracle, the trees broke. I stumbled out onto a gravel road, collapsing onto my knees. Ahead of me, headlights cutting through the dusk. A pickup truck screeched to a stop, the driver's door flying open. A man, middle-aged, flannel shirt, worn boots, rushed toward me, shouting something I couldn't hear over the pounding in my skull. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a sob. "You were in the forest?" His voice was sharp, urgent. I nodded weakly. His expression twisted, not pity, not confusion. "Fear. Did you talk to anyone in there?" I shook my head. Lie or not, I wasn't sure anymore. His eyes stayed locked on mine, dead serious now. "Did they look like your friends?" I couldn't answer. "Don't look back," he said, dragging me toward the truck. "Whatever you do, don't look back." I didn't. But as the truck sped down the road, headlights slicing through the night, I could feel it, someone standing at the edge of the trees. Watching. Smiling. I didn't speak the whole drive back. The man who picked me up didn't ask questions either. Not the ones you'd expect. Anyway. "No, what happened to you?" "No, where are your friends?" Just one question over and over again. "You didn't look back, right?" I shook my head each time. The truth was, I didn't need to look back. I could feel it. The pressure on the back of my neck. Like something just outside the truck's taillights was still watching. Still waiting. We reached the ranger station about an hour later. The man, he never told me his name, pulled the truck up fast, rushed me inside like the air outside was still dangerous. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly overhead, casting long, sterile shadows across the concrete floor. There was another man inside already. Older, gray-bearded, with the look of someone who'd spent too many years living next to something he couldn't explain. The two of them talked in low voices while I sat there, staring at my shredded shoes, trying to convince myself I was really out of those woods. I wasn't. Not yet. Eventually, the older man pulled up a chair and sat down across from me. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched me like he was waiting for something specific, like he needed to be sure I was still me. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "Tell me what you saw out there." I hesitated. Saying it out loud made it feel real. But something about the way he looked at me told me I didn't have to hold back. He already knew the shape of the story. I just had to fill in the gaps. I told him about the missing tents, the backward footprints, the voices pretending to be my friends. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his hands together like someone trying to warm themselves after a long time in the cold. "What about your reflection?" he asked. The question hit me like ice water. "My what?" "Your reflection. Did you see it while you were out there? In the water? In anything shiny?" I thought back. The creek we crossed. The sheen of my phone screen before it died. The glass of Darren's eyes when I found his body. I swallowed hard. "Why?" He leaned in closer. "They don't just take your voice, or your face. They watch until they know how to wear you. And sometimes they're faster if you catch your reflection too long. That's when they slip in, when you're not sure if the thing looking back is still you." The room felt colder all of a sudden. They let me sleep in the back office that night, though I don't think anyone expected me to actually rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voice again. "We're almost ready." And then, around 3 a.m., the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up fast, breath catching in my throat. It was faint, but steady, coming from the window just behind me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I forced myself to turn my head, just enough to see the reflection in the glass. It was Darren, or something that looked like him. The same dead eyes, the same twisted smile. His hand was pressed flat against the glass, fingers splayed too wide, like they were trying to stretch the shape of a human hand but didn't quite remember how. But the worst part? His mouth was moving. No sound, just the same words over and over, too quiet to hear but too clear to mistake. You're ready now. They found me at dawn, still sitting in the same spot, staring at the empty window. No footprints outside, no broken glass. But the marks from the handprint were still there, smudged across the glass. They never found Rachel's or Connor's bodies. The search teams combed through the woods for days, weeks, but there was nothing left. Not even scraps of clothing or torn fabric. Just that clearing like the forest had swallowed it whole. I told the police what happened, told them everything. They wrote it down, nodded, and filed it under psychological trauma due to exposure and stress. No arrests, no explanations, just another missing persons case. It's been months since I left Black Pines. I don't go outside much anymore. My reflection feels wrong some days, just a little too slow to move when I do or a little too fast to follow. I smashed every mirror in my house last week. And sometimes late at night I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. A voice behind me, too familiar to ignore, whispering from the shadows. We're ready now. A week ago, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. No name attached. Just 5 words. Where did you all go? The contact name updated on its own a few minutes later. Connor. I haven't opened the message since. I don't need to. I already know what it says. And this time, when they come knocking, I don't think I'll have the strength to stop them.